Welcome to U.S. History since 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history after Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, The American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on neutrality, embargo, and war entry in 1935-1941. The core question is this: at what point does a country stop being neutral if it is rewriting neutrality law, drafting men, leasing destroyers, escorting convoys, and cutting off another power's oil? The core competency is to confirm direct and indirect causes for America's entry into the Second World War. At what point does a country stop being neutral if it is rewriting neutrality law, drafting men, leasing destroyers, escorting convoys, and cutting off another power's oil? In the mid-1930s, the United States still carried the memory of 1917 strongly enough that Congress tried to legislate distance into permanent policy. The Nye Committee fixed the language of merchants of death in public debate, and the Neutrality Acts of 1935, 1936, and 1937 imposed embargoes, credit restrictions, and travel warnings meant to prevent another gradual slide into war. The world outside those statutes did not remain still. Mussolini invaded Ethiopia, Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland, absorbed Austria, and dismantled Czechoslovakia, while Japan deepened its war in China after 1937. Roosevelt saw these crises as connected signs of aggressive states revising the world order. Yet the quarantine speech of 1937 showed how limited domestic support for open intervention remained. Neutrality still had organized political strength, even as military planners and executive officials began to doubt that oceans could keep the Republic untouched. The fall of France in June 1940 made the question more urgent. A Europe once treated as distant now looked like a strategic timetable, and British survival tied directly to Atlantic shipping, basing, and hemispheric defense. From that point forward, the argument was no longer whether Americans disliked war. It was whether neutrality could still describe a country already moving men, material, and law toward one side of the conflict. The turning point came with the collapse of European peace in 1939. Germany invaded Poland on September 1st. Britain and France declared war 2 days later, and Roosevelt asked Congress to revise neutrality law. The Neutrality Act of November 1939 kept the ban on American ships entering war zones and retained the formal position of non-belligerency, but it repealed the arms embargo and replaced it with cash and carry for military goods. Belligerents could buy arms in the United States if they paid cash and carried the cargo in their own vessels. In practice, this favored Britain and France because the Royal Navy could protect Atlantic transport, while Germany could not openly use American markets in the same way. The statute looked even-handed on paper, yet the mechanics of sea power gave it a clear geopolitical direction. Neutrality law was still on the books, but it had been adjusted to help the coalition fighting Germany. That 1939 revision rested on an earlier legal sequence. The Neutrality Act of 1935 imposed an automatic arms embargo on belligerents and warned Americans traveling on belligerent ships that they did so at their own risk. The 1936 Act added a ban on loans and credits to nations at war. The 1937 Act extended embargo language, applied neutrality rules to civil wars, and allowed cash and carry for non-military goods. Congress had tried to build a statutory fence around shipping, lending, and munitions after concluding that the First World War had pulled the country into combat through commerce and finance. Roosevelt did not tear that fence down in one move. He widened one gate at a time, and each change depended on paperwork through customs offices, export licensing, treasury monitoring, and shipping restrictions that still let Washington claim formal neutrality while helping one side more than the other. The pace of German victory in 1940 made incremental revisions seem inadequate. Denmark and Norway fell in April, the Low Countries and France fell in May and June, and Britain stood alone after Dunkirk. Roosevelt responded with policies that prepared the country for a longer emergency. Congress passed the Two-Ocean Navy Act in July 1940, authorizing a massive naval expansion. In September, Roosevelt accepted the Selective Training and Service Act, the first peacetime draft in American history, requiring men between ages 21 and 35 to register for 12 months of service. That same month, the administration concluded the Destroyers for Bases Agreement. 50 overage American destroyers went to Britain, and in return, the United States received 99-year leases for base sites in Newfoundland, Bermuda, Jamaica, Antigua, Trinidad, British Guyana, and other British possessions in the Atlantic and Caribbean. The exchange linked American naval planning to British survival without going through the treaty process that two-thirds of the Senate would have required. Roosevelt used executive authority to move resources into the war against Germany while broadening the American strategic footprint across the Atlantic basin. Domestic debate remained intense. The America First Committee formed in September 1940 with supporters including Robert E. Wood, Gerald Nye, Burton Wheeler, and Charles Lindbergh. It argued that a fortified hemisphere, a strong navy, and continental defense offered a safer path than intervention in Europe. On the other side, William Allen White helped build the Committee to Defend America by aiding the Allies, which argued that British defeat would expose the Western Hemisphere to far greater danger. Roosevelt did not ask the public to embrace war in 1940. He asked them to embrace preparation, production, and aid. In his December 29, 1940 fireside chat, he called the United States the arsenal of democracy. That phrase joined factory output to strategic purpose. Rearmament was no longer presented as a temporary hedge. It was becoming the practical foundation of policy. By early 1941, Britain was short of dollars, shipping, and munitions. Roosevelt concluded that cash and carry had reached its limits because the government he wanted to assist could no longer pay in cash for long. The Lend-Lease Act, signed March 11, 1941, allowed the president to transfer defense articles to any country whose defense he judged vital to the defense of the United States. Congress had turned a commercial exception into a strategic supply system. Britain was the first major beneficiary, and after June 1941, the Soviet Union also received aid after Germany invaded it in Operation Barbarossa. Trucks, aircraft, machine tools, food, rails, aluminum, radio equipment, and other material now tied American production directly to the Allied war effort. War had not been declared, yet American industry was sustaining one side in the largest conflict on Earth. The naval line moved at the same time. Roosevelt declared a security zone in the Western Atlantic, ordered the Navy to report Axis ship movements to Britain, and extended U.S. patrol activity. After German submarines torpedoed the destroyer USS Greer in September 1941, Roosevelt announced a shoot-on-sight order against Axis raiders in waters essential to American defense. The sinking of the USS Kearney in October and the USS Reuben James later that month showed how narrow the margin had become between undeclared naval conflict and formal belligerency. Congress still had not declared war, yet American ships were escorting convoys partway across the Atlantic and exchanging fire with German submarines. The institutional habits of war were already in place across procurement, convoy planning, intelligence, and naval command. The administrative line narrowed further through staff planning and occupation decisions that looked technical at the time. In the ABC-1 staff talks held in Washington between January and March 1941, American and British planners agreed that if the United States entered the war, Germany would remain the primary enemy even while Japan threatened in the Pacific. In July 1941, U.S. Marines relieved British forces in Iceland, and American naval escorts extended deeper into the Atlantic to protect traffic moving toward Britain. The August 1941 Atlantic Charter Meeting off Newfoundland added public principles about self-determination, trade access, and post-war security to arrangements that already depended on destroyer escorts, convoy lanes, and naval intelligence. Those steps did not produce a declaration, but they did create an operating pattern in which American officers, shipyards, and supply bureaus were preparing for coalition war rather than detached neutrality. Japanese expansion created the Pacific side of the same transformation. Japan had seized Manchuria in 1931, launched full war in China in 1937, and joined Germany and Italy in the Tripartite Pact in September 1940. The United States responded in steps. The Export Control Act of July 1940 let the administration restrict sales of aviation fuel, scrap iron, and machinery with strategic value. In July 1941, after Japanese forces moved into southern French Indochina, Roosevelt froze Japanese assets in the United States. Britain and the Dutch East Indies aligned their controls with Washington, and the result was an effective oil cutoff. Japan imported most of its petroleum and relied heavily on American supplies, so the embargo narrowed Tokyo's choices to withdrawal, negotiation, or seizure of resource-rich territory in Southeast Asia. Secretary of State Cordell Hull demanded respect for Chinese sovereignty and a retreat from aggressive expansion. Japanese military leaders, especially within the Navy General Staff and the Imperial Conference structure, concluded that time was running against them. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto supported a first strike against the U.S. Pacific Fleet as a way to buy freedom of action for Southern expansion. The key point in 1941 is institutional pressure. Roosevelt needed Britain to survive, wanted Germany checked, and refused to let Japan dominate East Asia without cost. Congress had authorized rearmament and supply, but the public still distinguished aid from war. Policy therefore moved through production contracts, export controls, patrol orders, and executive agreements. By autumn 1941, neutrality existed more as a constitutional description than as a full account of what American power was already doing. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, killed more than 2,400 Americans, damaged or sank battleships, and destroyed aircraft across Oahu. On December 8th, Roosevelt stood before Congress with a text built for one institutional result. The phrase, "a date which will live in infamy," fixed the event in public memory, while suddenly and deliberately attacked fixed blame and intent in the congressional record. He did not walk legislators back through the Neutrality Acts, the Destroyer Deal, Atlantic patrol orders, the oil embargo, or the failed exchanges with Tokyo. He put a single wound in front of them and asked for a declaration that a state of war already existed. That compression was the weapon. Members listening in the chamber did not need a long diplomatic brief. They needed language that collapsed months of tension into a constitutional trigger. Congress approved the declaration against Japan with one dissenting vote, and on December 11th, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, producing reciprocal American declarations in Europe. Roosevelt's wording emphasized treachery, deliberation, and national defense because those words moved votes faster than a recital of naval patrol boundaries or export control schedules. The speech turned executive preparation into legislative action in a single morning. The harder pressure appears when the speech is set against the Arsenal of Democracy address from December 1940. That earlier broadcast argued for materiel, contracts, and production lines as the means of defending the Republic without immediate combat. The December 8th address discarded that intermediate posture. The administration had already armed Britain, embargoed Japan, ordered the first peacetime draft, and expanded naval patrols. Roosevelt chose not to litigate that chain in the chamber. He used infamy to seal the transition from guarded involvement to declared war. And he chose those words because they could survive the headlines, the vote tally, and the constitutional record all at once. The consequences were immediate. Isolationism as a mass political force collapsed after Pearl Harbor. The armed services expanded into global operations, and industrial mobilization accelerated through shipbuilding, aircraft contracts, and war production. Within days, the Atlantic and Pacific became parts of one national war commitment, and the older hope that distance alone could manage American security was finished. The longer consequence lies in the sequence that produced the Declaration. The United States moved from embargo law to selective exceptions, from selective exceptions to rearmament, from rearmament to alliance support, and from alliance support to undeclared naval and economic conflict before Congress ever declared war. By December 1941, Washington already had conscription, base leases, convoy routines, export controls, and supply pipelines in place. Pearl Harbor made the transition unmistakable, but it did not invent the transition. That sequence gave later presidents and legislators proof that large commitments often begin before formal belligerency. Administrative preparation, economic coercion, patrol orders, and industrial supply all became familiar thresholds in modern foreign policy. Once built, those thresholds made it easier to move from legal neutrality into practical conflict without naming the endpoint at once. That leaves the hardest judgment in the middle years rather than on December 8, 1941. If neutrality can survive in law, while convoys, embargoes, rearmament, and material support are already pulling the country into war, then the unresolved problem is not whether Pearl Harbor changed the formal date. It is whether a democracy can honestly recognize the moment it has already chosen war before the Declaration catches up.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.